November 9th, 1918. Northeastern France. 2 days before the guns of the Great War would finally fall silent. The dawn broke grey and cold over a landscape that looked more like the surface of another planet than the earth men once called home. The ground was churned into a paste of mud and wire, cratered by shells and frozen with frost. All around, the smell of damp earth mingled with cordite and decay, the breath of a battlefield that refused to rest. Private Walter H. Johnson of the 313th Infantry crouched low in a trench barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. His greatcoat was stiff with dried mud, his helmet tilted low against the drizzle. In his left hand, he held his rifle. Bolt open, a fresh clip sliding into place. In his breast pocket, tucked beside a folded photograph of his wife and a battered silver pocket watch, was a small Bible his mother had sent him when he left Minnesota. He had stopped checking the watch weeks ago. The mechanism had long since frozen, its ticking drowned beneath the thunder of artillery. Still, he carried it, not for time, but for memory. Overhead, the sky flashed white as another shell exploded somewhere beyond the line. The concussion rattled the duckboards beneath his boots. "Keep your head down," a corporal shouted from the next traverse, voice hoarse from days without rest. Johnson ducked instinctively, pressing against the slick wall of the trench as dirt and fragments of shrapnel rained down. A whistle cut through the chaos. It was time to move. The men surged upward, rifles ready, boots squelching as they climbed the muddy ladders over the parapet. Johnson followed, his breath clouding in the chill. Ahead, through the fog and smoke, lay a shattered wood where the enemy still held their ground. A few 100 yards that had cost hundreds of lives. Machine guns chattered from the tree line, invisible flashes in the grey mist. Bullets cracked past like snapping twigs. Johnson threw himself forward, his pack slamming into his back as he hit the mud. Around him, men were crawling, shouting, falling. The world had become a blur of noise and movement, gunfire, cries for medics, the dull thud of shells landing too close. He pushed on, rifle clutched tight, crawling through the mud 1 yard at a time. He could feel the pounding of his heart in his ears, the dry rasp of his breath beneath the weight of his gear. Somewhere to his left, a man screamed. Somewhere ahead, a whistle blew again, the signal to push forward. Johnson rose halfway, firing toward the flashes in the trees. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he barely noticed. Adrenaline carried him through the chaos. The ground erupted beside him, showering him with mud. Then came the sound, a single sharp crack. Something struck him hard in the chest like a hammer blow. He fell backward, his rifle spinning from his grasp. For a moment, everything went silent, the world narrowing to the pounding of his pulse and the high, cold seeping into his skin. He gasped, certain he'd been hit. The impact had knocked the breath from him. Hands trembling, he reached for his chest, expecting to find blood. But there was none. Only torn fabric and the faint gleam of metal. His fingers brushed against the pocket of his tunic, warm, dented, and smoking slightly. The bullet had struck directly over his heart, and there, embedded deep in the ruined face of his pocket watch, the round had stopped. Crushed and twisted, its journey ended by the smallest chance of fate and steel. The watch's glass had shattered, its hands frozen forever at 8:17. Johnson stared at it in disbelief. Around him, battle still raged, but for that single instant, the world held still. The machine gun fire faded into the distance. The shouts became distant echoes. He was alive. The realization hit him harder than the bullet had. He drew in a shaking breath, clutched the ruined watch in his hand, and whispered a prayer he hadn't said since boyhood. Then, with a grunt, he pushed himself back to his knees, grabbed his rifle, and moved forward again. The war hadn't ended, not yet. But now he carried something more than fear, a strange, stubborn sense that maybe, just maybe, something greater had kept him alive for a reason. Mud clung to Walter Johnson's boots as he stumbled through the shell-torn ground, clutching his rifle in one hand and the broken watch in the other. The metal was warm against his skin, still carrying the heat of the bullet that should have ended his life. He slipped the watch back into his breast pocket, its weight somehow heavier now, more sacred. Around him, the battlefield groaned and smoked, the air thick with the smell of burned powder and the cries of wounded men. "Johnson, you hit!" someone shouted from ahead. It was Corporal Davis, crouched behind the stump of a blasted tree. Johnson shook his head, panting. "Watch stop the damn thing," he said, his voice cracking between disbelief and adrenaline. Davis blinked, his mud-smeared face contorting into a grin. "Then get your lucky self up here, Private. We ain't done yet." They pressed forward, moving from crater to crater as the enemy lines began to falter. The ground was littered with helmets, spent casings, and the debris of 1,000 broken lives. Every step was a gamble between cover and chaos. Johnson moved like a man possessed, not fearless, but unbreakable. The sting of near death had changed something in him. By late afternoon, the gunfire thinned. The enemy, worn and starving, began to retreat. The thunder of the front dulled into scattered shots and the distant moan of the wounded. Johnson and his unit dug in near the edge of a ruined farmhouse, just timbers and brick dust now, and waited for orders. The lieutenant, a weary man with a torn sleeve and eyes like smoke, gathered them around a flickering lamp. "Word is the war's all but over," he said quietly. "Rumor of an armistice. Could be hours, could be days. Till then, stay sharp. The last bullets fired in a war are always the dumbest." That night, Johnson sat beside a makeshift fire, turning the ruined pocket watch in his hand. Its face was spider-webbed with cracks. The bullet had crushed the inner gears, but the chain still glinted faintly in the orange light. The inscription on the back, "From Mother, Christmas 1916, was scratched but legible. He thought of her then, of her standing on the porch back home, her hands wringing a kerchief as he'd boarded the train. He could almost hear her voice. "You keep that watch close, Walter. Your father carried it through the last war." He smiled faintly. His father's war had been the Spanish-American. His own had been hell on a scale no man could have imagined. But now, 2 generations of Johnson men had been saved by the same piece of metal. In the distance, artillery rumbled, the last convulsions of a dying beast. Johnson leaned back against a sandbag and watched the stars emerge through the drifting smoke. His chest still ached where the bullet had struck, but the pain only reminded him that he was still breathing. Still here. Around midnight, the lieutenant came by again. "You should get some rest," he murmured. Johnson nodded but didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. "Reckon I might," he said. He didn't sleep. At dawn, the sound of bugles echoed faintly through the mist. Not the harsh calls of attack, but something softer, unfamiliar. Men stood slowly, peering toward the front. A runner came stumbling through the mud, waving a scrap of paper. "Ceasefire!" he shouted, voice breaking. "The war's over. The Germans signed." For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then, as the truth sank in, the trenches erupted in cheers and sobs. Helmets flew into the air. Some men laughed until they cried. Others simply sank to their knees, exhausted and hollow. Johnson stayed still. He reached into his pocket, drew out the shattered watch, and stared at it. The bullet mark caught the pale morning light. A tiny crater in the metal, proof of everything he'd survived. He whispered, "Guess we made it, old man," and slipped it back into his coat. 2 days later, he walked out of the trenches for the last time. The mud, the wire, the endless thunder, all of it fading behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The watch, heavy against his heart, carried every memory that mattered. Weeks later, Private Walter H. Johnson stepped off the troop train in Minneapolis. The air smelled of coal smoke and snow, of city streets alive with life instead of death. Children ran past, their laughter ringing sharp and clear. Women waved from porches, men tipped their hats. And there, in the crowd, stood his mother, kerchief in hand, eyes wide with disbelief. "Walter!" she cried, rushing forward. Johnson dropped his pack and fell into her embrace. The war, all its horror and weight, seemed to collapse into that single heartbeat of recognition. She held him tightly, and he let the tears come, hot and unashamed, running down his frozen cheeks. He pulled back enough to see her face. I made it," he whispered, voice hoarse. She only nodded, pressing her forehead to his. His father and brother arrived moments later, their expressions a mix of pride and incredulity. They didn't speak much at first. Words seemed inadequate. Walter showed them the watch, the shattered glass, the dent where the bullet had struck, the inscription faded but still visible. "You saved my life," he murmured, holding it close. His mother shook her head. "No, God did," she said simply. But Walter didn't argue. Perhaps both were true. In the days that followed, reporters tracked him down. Cameras clicked, microphones captured his hoarse voice. Headlines praised the miraculous pocket watch, the bullet that didn't kill him, the soldier who had stared down death and walked back. But Walter knew the truth. It wasn't just luck. It was something finer, a thread of stubbornness and will, a refusal to yield even when the world demanded surrender. He returned to his pre-war life slowly. The quiet of Minnesota was at first unbearable. The familiar smells of pine and snow a jarring contrast to the mud, blood, and smoke of France. Every creak of the floorboards reminded him of trenched timbers. Every distant boom of fireworks echoed artillery. Nightmares came often. The scream of men, the whistle of shells, the flash of rifles in the mist. Yet every morning he awoke alive. Every morning he touched the watch and felt the miracle anew. The Medal of Honor he never received didn't matter. The pocket watch, dented and shattered, hung in a small wooden case in the family parlor, a silent testament to the day fate bent in his favor. Friends and strangers alike would ask about it. He'd recount the story, how it had stopped a bullet, how it had saved him, how a simple object could carry the weight of life itself. In the evenings, he sometimes sat with his Bible open, tracing the passages he had carried through mud and blood. The words comforted him in ways nothing else could. And as he read, he would whisper a prayer of thanks, not for the end of the war, but for the continuation of his story, a story that, for one bullet's breadth, had not ended in France. Years later, he would give the watch to his children. "It's not the watch that saved me," he would say. "It's the will to keep going, to survive when every chance tells you to give up. Remember that." And they did. The story of the bullet, the watch, and the life it preserved became legend in his family. A lesson that courage is not always loud, that miracles often hide in the ordinary, and that survival is a quiet, stubborn art. Decades later, Walter H. Johnson stood in the dim light of his study, the pocket watch resting in his palm. The glass was cracked, the metal scarred, and yet it gleamed faintly, a quiet monument to the day a bullet chose him to live. Outside, the streets of Minneapolis bustled with a life he had once feared he would never see. Children laughed in the distance, the echo of freedom that had once seemed impossible after the mud and smoke of France. He ran his thumb along the dented surface, recalling the sharp report of the rifle, the searing heat as metal tore through air, and the impossible stop of fate. Every detail was vivid, from the mud-caked trenches to the smell of gunpowder and blood, from the cries of comrades to the silence that followed the near death. In that silence, the watch had been both shield and symbol. It had been luck, yes, but also a testament to a life refused to be surrendered. Walter reflected on the irony of war, how ordinary objects, a watch, a notebook, a Bible, could alter destiny. How chance, combined with courage and presence of mind, could carve survival from the jaws of death. He remembered Private Johnson in France, face set with determination, chest heaving, heart pounding. He remembered the voices of his comrades, the mud, the rain, the roar of artillery, and the simple miracle that had kept him alive. By the 1960s, his story had spread beyond family and friends. Local newspapers ran features about the pocket watch that saved a life. War museums requested it for display. Scholars cited it as an example of the strange, personal histories that make up the human side of global conflict. And yet, Walter always insisted that the story was not about luck or medal-worthy heroics. It was about resilience, about the will to rise each time life tried to strike him down, about carrying forward even when survival seemed improbable. He began visiting schools and veteran groups, holding the watch aloft as he recounted the battle, the bullet, and the quiet miracle. Children stared wide-eyed. Veterans nodded knowingly, seeing in him the echo of their own close calls. And in each telling, Walter reminded them, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to succumb to it. The pocket watch was the tangible proof, but the real life-saving force had been the mind and spirit behind it. In his later years, Walter traveled back to France, walking through fields where the mud still smelled faintly of gunpowder after storms, where craters scarred the earth, and where the ghosts of comrades lingered in memory. He knelt, tracing the earth with his hands, whispering thanks for the life he had been granted and for the men who had survived alongside him. He left the watch on a stone, not as a relic, but as a marker of human endurance. Proof that ordinary objects, combined with extraordinary will, could rewrite destiny. Walter H. Johnson died peacefully in his sleep many years later, the pocket watch still in the family's possession. It remained a symbol not just of survival, but of the quiet, enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the chaos of war, in the face of death, one life can be saved by courage, resilience, and the smallest miracle carried in a pocket